Okay, thank you everyone for coming to our session today, The Future of China's Green Revolution. I'm John Pfeffer. I'm the Director of Foreign Policy and Focus at the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, D.C. And I'm delighted to have this incredible panel here today to tell us about what's going on inside China and outside China in relation to its energy and environment policy. I'm going to introduce Tobita Chow, who's going to moderate our conversation today. Toby is the founding director of Justice is Global, which is part of People's Action, and a leading thinker and activist on issues connected to China and U.S.-Chinese relations. Toby, I'm going to pass it on to you and then disappear.
Great, thanks, Sean. Thank you everyone for joining us today. And thanks to Jennifer and Hongqiao for speaking as panelists. So the topic today is on the future of China's Green Revolution. Given the size of its economy and population, China can't help but determine the nature and pace of global transition to a clean energy future. And on the one hand, China is rapidly expanding its capacity to generate electricity from wind and solar and has publicly pledged to stop financing the construction of overseas coal-powered plants. It has also promised to become carbon neutral by 2060. On the other hand, China's economic growth has increased its overall demand for energy. It remains the largest consumer of coal in the world and is now also the leading source of carbon emissions. So we're joined today by LIU Hongqiao and Jennifer Turner. Some questions we may consider. What are the prospects for U.S.-China cooperation on climate and energy issues? And is China's Belt and Road Initiative a help or hindrance when it comes to global just transition? What can we expect from China in its climate pledges? So we're joined by LIU Hongqiao, who is a Paris-based independent consultant and journalist. Her primary work focus is China's emergence and its global impact on the environment, biodiversity, energy, and the climate. She's the winner of the China Environmental Press Award and has published in numerous outlets in China and globally. We are also joined by Jennifer Turner, who has served as director of the Wilson Center's China Environment Forum for 23 years, convening NGOs, research, government, and business experts to explore China's energy and environmental challenges. She's a widely quoted expert on U.S.-China environmental cooperation, as well as climate-related challenges and governance issues facing the world's most populous country. So thank you both for joining us. And Hongqiao, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation. I will just, I'm told I have 10 minutes to unpack China's climate pledges, so I'll do that very quickly. Can you see my screen okay? And hear me okay? Okay, I'll just go ahead. So, it's been already more than a year that since China made its climate pledge under the new pledge under the Paris Agreement. The new climate pledge is widely cited as the dual carbon goals, or 双碳 as in Chinese, Mandarin Chinese. The pledge is that China will peak carbon dioxide emissions before 2030 and achieve carbon neutrality before 2060. The first target covers only carbon dioxide emissions. The second is set to cover all greenhouse gases emissions. We need to understand a few things. First, China is currently the world's largest greenhouse gases emitter if we calculate on annual emission basis. It's also the second largest historical emitter. So to achieve these dual carbon goals means a lot to the global decarbonization. It can prevent a further 0.2 to 0.3 degree of global warming. I know it might sound not a lot, but we are actually, the current policy scenario is headed, is putting our planet heading towards a 3 degree to 2.5, at least 2.5 to 3 degree global warming. So China is making its share. You can argue with that it's fair or not, or it's taking its fair, whether it can be enhanced, but well, we'll leave that further. Another very important point to notice that China has a very short action window to achieve this this climate pledge. Just put into comparison with the EU or with the United States, for example, China is basically China has to peak its emissions in the next few years and achieve from as shown here, from the top, the peak of its emissions to net zero in about 30 years, which will take the US and the European countries 70, 80 years to do that, just the second half of that. So the question here is that can China turn or regenerate a new model from the past, let's say, in the past 20, 30 years of the China economy miracle that it has created to China decarbonize a miracle in the second half, in another 30 years to come. To give you a few more contexts, I know a lot of US colleagues, widely cited in newspapers and op-ed. Recently, I just rebutted an op-ed published on Wall Street Journal, arguing that the United States, anything the United States do on climate mitigation wouldn't matter if, given that China's emissions are still growing. I think there are a few things to understand here. China's first climate pledge, made in Copenhagen in 2009, has consequently slowed down China's emissions, and then in 2015, after the Paris Agreement was made, China's new pledge, the first NDC, as shown here in green, the curve would mean China to reduce emissions a lot compared to the line in yellow, which will be the business as usual scenario without any climate actions intentionally. But in reality, China's emissions could peak earlier and at a lower level, as shown here, the third line. And that would mean a lot, as I mentioned, to global emissions and the awarded emissions from 2030 to 2060, which I couldn't draw here, but that basically is the same amount of China's accumulated emissions in the past 30 years. And we also need to understand a few things. We're really witnessing a fundamental change in China's energy mix from not today's level, but in 2020, 84% of fossil energy in its primary energy mix to over 80%, which means basically switch fossil fuels with non-fossils in about 40 years. And we all know that China is very dependent on coal, but that situation is changing. If you look at the gray bars here, so basically since 2009, China has managed to reduce the share of coal in its primary energy consumption and electricity consumption by about 15 and 22 percentage points since, in the last 13 years. But again, that since the share of coal is still about 56% at the moment in primary energy consumption and 60% in electricity consumption. But coal will soon to drop to below 50% by 2025. And if we count clean energy, wind and solar, together with nuclear, etc., their share can actually reach more than just the 80% that China has pledged. It can be up to 97%. So net zero is really, it's not just a quantitative target on greenhouse gases emissions. China has, I don't work for the government, but I'm interpreting what the Chinese government or the policymakers think. They do think addressing climate change is a lever to a level of the system to change China's entire energy structure, economic structure, and to put China to a pathway of decarbonization, but also more importantly, high quality development. Here I'm citing our wording data. If you look at the embedded carbon of the United States and which is shown above, and China, which is shown below, you can see that at the peak back in about 2006 and 2007, embedded energy accounted for about 1/5 of China's domestic energy consumption. That situation is changing, but still, international trade goods still account for about 5% of China's domestic consumption, while the United States, on the other hand, has been on positive. It has been the world's largest net importer of embedded carbon. Well, you may argue they don't import or outsource the emissions to China, but definitely in a lot of developing countries. So we were witnessing a few things, a few trends that can be exciting and inspiring. On the left-hand side is I indexed China's GDP and China's energy consumption and the coal in 2009, when China made its first international climate pledge to tackle climate change. And we can see that China's GDP has grown more than 3 times over the period, while China's energy consumption only grew by about 1.5 times, and even less on coal. We can see this trend. China hasn't really, absolutely decoupled its GDP growth with energy consumption and emissions, but the trend is bringing us to the direction that decoupling might happen very soon. And on the right hand side, is another illustration between China's GDP growth per capita and CO2 emissions per capita. You can also see that China managed to maintain a high growth of GDP growth per capita after 2009, while largely maintaining a stable level of emissions per capita, both in consumption and production. And what's really exciting is that the provinces and the cities are really become the gatekeepers of China's decarbonization. It's not just a climate pledge made by China's leadership from the top CPC or the central government. Local governments are actually implementing that and interpreting this climate pledge into solid actions. And we can see this recent report published by Greenpeace showing that in some front-runner provinces in China, we can already witness a strong decoupling on the left-hand side, including Shanghai, Beijing, Guangdong, and Zhejiang, a strong decoupling of GDP growth and emissions, and a relatively weak decoupling of GDP growth and emissions in Tianjin, Hebei, Jiangsu, and Anhui. And you can see their current intensity reduction has largely exceeded what China at the national level has pledged, which is 40 to 48%, as shown, indicated in the pink line here. And you can see that Beijing, for example, has overachieved that target by almost half. And other front runners like Sichuan province has pledged to ban nuclear power projects in the 14th five-year plan period, and the Zhangjiakou were hosted the Winter Olympic. If you count its territory as a country, then its installed capacity of wind and solar would rank the 10th largest in the world. I will stop here, and I'm happy to answer your questions. If you would like to follow my analysis online, here are the links. Thank you.
Thank you, Hongqiao, for that very quick and thorough overview of the climate trends in China. For a note to the participants, the other folks who are joining us in this Zoom, this was mentioned in the chat, but just so everyone can hear this, that the chat is open for all attendees, and you can also submit questions as we go along in the Q&A section of this Zoom. Okay, so let me pass it to Jennifer.
Yes, indeedy. Hi there, everyone. So yeah, thank you, Hongqiao. She covered a lot of stuff in a short amount of time. The upshot is China's been very big on its climate action particularly over the past 10 years. They also, I have this image up here just to remind us that around the same time that they started ramping up their climate action was, of course, in the early, 2012, 2013, when the northern part of the country was hit with just these, really shocking air apocalypses. And so in 2014, China declared war on pollution. And notably in 2014, the U.S. and China signed their bilateral climate agreement. And that agreement is what paved the way for the Paris Agreement. And it's important to note that those two things are linked. I mean, China's war on pollution, which, has been nothing short of phenomenal in terms of like air quality right now. I mean, if you're addressing the coal problem for air pollution, cars for air pollution, it also has co-benefits for climate. And that's something that the government is also very aware of. I mean, the Chinese public was getting more and more angry. In the 2007, 8, and 9, you started seeing a lot of street protests, also on social media about air quality in cities. And so a lot of the action that the government has taken, it's for the economy, but it's also for social stability and economic growth, as Hongqiao pointed out. Now, the U.S. China relationship has many bumpy roads before and in the future coming for us. But in the area of environment and climate, it's really become part of the two countries' DNA. And I say that because for 23 years, I've had a great front row seat to look at how the two countries have worked together. Now, during the Obama administration, there were these 7 clean energy agreements. And we had this kind of, I called it the climate and air quality ping pong, right? We had different types of forums and different mechanisms, like the clean energy research centers were bringing together national labs, NGOs, companies to try to solve some of those really wicked problems with, electric vehicles. So technology, but needing to look for policies to enable that technology. So it was pretty much a super busy time between, the two countries. But I want to point out that even though at the gov to gov level, the relationship appears to be in the dumpers right now, to think that in the climate and environment space, that at the subnational level, both with California, other cities, other states, and also this is scratching the surface of NGOs. I mean, I think the top 4 rows there are organizations that all have offices in China. Side note, that about 2018, foreign NGOs were required to register. In Chinese, we say mafan. It's a little bit of a hassle, but a lot of, bigger international groups, they were able to do the registration. They have no problem with being transparent about their plans and things, but it did have a cooling effect on a number of organizations working in China, not just in the environment space, but also made it a lot more difficult for international foundations to support groups in China. But again, these partnerships, I mean, everything from like coal, like that, because you heard that from Hongqiao, that Natural Resource Defense Council. I remember about 13 years ago when they started talking to the Chinese government and their counterparts and researchers about putting on a coal cap. And I thought, you guys are crazy, China capping their coal? But lo and behold, I mean, what do we have now? So that you have these groups, and again, most of these U.S. NGOs that are in China, their offices are populated by Chinese nationals now. And so there's been a lot of partnerships. And to the right there, this was former Governor Jerry Brown signing with it's China's climate envoy now, Xie Zhenhua, to an agreement. This was about a year after the Trump administration came into office, to create a California-China climate initiative, because the two of them, they wanted to continue the kind of subnational cooperation and dialogues. I mean, the Wilson Center, I keep conversations going, and it just, so I think that there's a lot of concern that the two countries aren't going to come together on climate again, but I would argue that there's still things happening, albeit at a slower rate. Highlighting too, that within China, there are some NGO political space for NGOs kind of opens and closes, but there have been some, like Ma Jun, from the Institute of Public and Environmental Affairs, revolutionary in terms of really promoting information transparency about pollution. They have a water pollution, air pollution map, but my all-time favorite is the Black and Filthy River map, which came about when the Ministries of Environment and Housing, Ministry of Housing, they issued a call on social media to the Chinese public. This is, I think, in like 2017, and said, tell us if you find foul and stinky rivers, geolocate it, send us a picture. Well, they were just inundated with information. And so they turned to Ma Jun and some other NGOs to help them kind of map this. And so so you have this citizen science type initiative that was catalyzed by the government, where Chinese NGOs are helping to collate it, track it, and make sure that, that the government responds. And so I give you this little dabble of, here's one more of information, how Chinese NGOs, they do have their feet on the ground. This one is Green Hunan. I mean, for about 10 years that they've created networks of citizens who go out and monitor the river. And they sometimes just take photos, sometimes they report directly to the government. So they've become the ears and eyes of the local environmental protection bureaus that can't monitor in such ways. This has been seen as a model by the government. And now I think Green Hunan has done trainings moving up the Yangtze River to promote these kind of citizen action. And that is because part of the war on pollution that the government, being pragmatic, knows they can't do it all. I mean, they've been putting a lot of pressure on local governments, pushing transparency, but realizing opening space for grassroots groups is also important. Let's move on. So now back to kind of a little bit U.S. China stuff, that the two countries, we also have had kind of an interlinked electric vehicle revolution. I mean, Xi Jinping said about 2 years ago that in 2030, 2035, that they're no longer going to produce or sell internal combustion engines. That's a global game changer. And we've seen it today, where now, I mean, you can't, in my little town of Kensington, I'm seeing electric vehicles all over the place now. I haven't, Toby, have you gotten your electric vehicle yet? Not yet, okay. But I should want to point out that for years, Chinese experts, government delegations, scientists have been working with the California Air Resources Board and the state of California to understand California's zero emission vehicle program. China modeled it on theirs. So it just seemed that the two are interlinked in sometimes in innovative things. Just noting another way of kind of a Chinese global game changer was a couple of years ago when China announced that they were in the green sword policy. For the record, I love the names on some of these policies, that no longer going to take recycled waste. And it was a global game changer. And a lot of us now in our cities in the States, they've had to cancel recycling programs because China had been absorbing about half of the world's, recyclables, market for recyclables, because they were using it as industrial feedstock. But China's now choking on their own municipal waste. So again, this is the other front of the war is on waste pollution now. So it's kind of like it wasn't our choice to be a partner in China with this, but they did change. And and what is it? Just earlier this year, we did have a agreement to have a global treaty on plastic waste. Don't know if there's a straight line. I'll keep moving to. I've just got a couple more things here. Want to flag too that there's also needs for more partnerships and standards, between U.S. and China and others instead of war. For example, on lithium, and I know Hongqiao has done a lot on this, and we'll let her answer questions in the Q&A. But lithium, okay, where's our phones, right? What are the batteries in our computers and in the electric vehicles and wind turbines? Use lithium, rare earth metals, and there's a lot of complaints today that China controls the markets, but China had just been very openly investing in them for years. They're very dirty markets. And now, I've hosted meetings over the years where people have come in and talked about, like in the Democratic Republic of Congo, how different kinds of copper mining, how there's human rights abuses and environmental pollution problems. But the West hasn't really stepped up like, well, there needs to be standards and there maybe needs to be investment. So this is an opportunity because the demand for lithium is going to increase by 4,000% in the next 15 years. And, and green standards need to be made. Also kind of pointing out, besides the normal energy cooperation on climate, the issue of food. Both countries, we are the global superpowers on food. And globally, 1/3 of greenhouse gas emissions come from ag and food production. Just shameless self-promotion. We're just starting to launch a food and climate initiative at the Wilson Center. So you'll be hearing more, we'll be putting on more conversations on this. But I think that, besides looking how both countries, in ensuring, carbon action in their food production and throughout the supply chain, we could learn from each other, be big, have a big impact. The two countries are also, and Europe as well, responsible for, their agricultural imports have been leading to greenhouse gas emissions and biodiversity loss and all kinds of social and cultural threats in Brazil and other countries around the world as we get our timber, beef, leather, palm oil, you name it. So there's room for improvement on both sides. And in a couple of weeks, I'm going to have a meeting with some folks who are going to talk about the greening the BRI. I'm just flagging this, so Toby, so we're going to talk more in the Q&A, but that, Xi Jinping has pledged to green the BRI, and Toby mentioned that, yes, they're stopping investments in coal-fired power plants. They have a brand new traffic light program to kind of try to rate projects, whether they're going to have a major, moderate, or light impact to try to create incentives, but noting too that most of China's BR investments are government investments as opposed to private sector. There's a lot of other global infrastructure investment initiatives out there. There's Blue Dot Network, Fast Infra, et cetera. But there can be kind of like a race to the top on this by setting global standards. And I'm going to end with this, that this is why is it important that, that the U.S. and China are both motivated to deal with climate change. I mean, on the left, we've got Lake Poyang, China's largest lake, which has been drying for years. The most recent heat wave, catastrophic influences. Lake Mead, our largest reservoir, getting ever shallower. And I don't know, let's see how many millions of people are dependent on the Colorado River. So, while our two climate envoys they've got out 2 agreements last year, not a lot of action right now, but I'm confident that the two countries, be it at the national and subnational, will find some ways to move forward. That's it. Sorry if I went a little over there, but I just wanted to throw lots of things on the table, and then you and the audience can ask some questions.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Jennifer and Hongqiao, for your presentations. I really appreciate being in conversation with both of you, and just the wealth of expertise and experience that you bring to this complicated issue of China's approach to climate. So again, everyone who has joined us in this Zoom conversation, please put your questions into the Q&A, and we will get into this conversation. Before we move to questions, though, I would like to maybe really highlight this issue of U.S. China cooperation on climate. Some of my work on China's approach to climate comes from the perspective in my own organizing and advocacy work, comes from my attempt to look for a promising strategy for progressives to establish an alternative to the U.S.-China relationship that gets away from the dominant framework of great power competition, which I think is dangerous in many ways. And I've looked to U.S.-China climate cooperation as a very promising route to define a healthy and more cooperative U.S.-China relationship. And I think there's been some promising things there. One thing I'm interested in particular is the prospects for U.S.-China cooperation on clean energy development and tech sharing in the global South, which could be a powerful way to address issues of global climate justice, the intersection between global inequality and climate change. One question here is about the Belt and Road Initiative, and so on the one hand, the Belt and Road Initiative could become a very promising source of accelerating clean energy transition in a number of global South countries. On the other hand, it's also been a source of financing for coal projects and other fossil fuel projects. There have also been other problems with the Belt and Road Initiative, including poor lending standards and labor abuses. And China has started to make efforts to address these problems. One of those efforts is this campaign to green the BRI. Rebecca Ray at the GDP Center at Boston University co-authored a report on greening the BRI and was asked in an interview what would be the biggest policy change that she would like to see when it came to greening the BRI. And her response was interesting, was that it would involve not like a policy change, but sort of a strategy change or something where we would see more cooperation between China and the US on development projects, and that the US could contribute greatly to accelerating progress on improving BRI standards, including on green standards by partnering on BRI projects. And this is something that China has proposed, including like earlier this year. It's something that would give the US a say on standards governing any projects that it collaborates on with China. But of course, things have gotten more difficult here now that China has suspended U.S. China climate talks following Pelosi's trip to Taiwan. Earlier this month, John Kerry, President Biden's climate envoy, expressed he was hopeful that climate talks could resume. But this is something that I think that we should consider. Like, what do we think are the prospects of resuming climate talks and perhaps pursuing this kind of cooperation on sustainable development globally, which I think could do a lot for global climate change work and also become a source of like a healthier relationship between our two countries. Let's see. All right, so starting to get some questions now. I'm wondering, I wanted to just give a chance for Jennifer and Hongqiao if you have any questions for each other based on your presentations. If not, we can move to questions from the audience.
Well, maybe, can I take your last comment about, thanks for citing Rebecca. She's gonna come speak for me in a month, I think. She's awesome. That, the issue of like how the US and China could come together. And maybe I want to ask, because Hongqiao, you've done a lot in the past on the rare earths issue and lithium. What do you see as what, how, like logically, how can the two countries come together on raising the standards for these kinds of mining? Is it going to be, is it going to just have to be kind of competition, kind of a race to the top there, that the US separately, maybe with Europe and other partners, starts to support greener kinds of mining in this sector? What's your thoughts on that?
Thanks, Jennifer. Yes, I did some work on rare earths back in 2013, 2016. I think at the moment, raising environmental standards and social standards of rare earth mining and other critical raw materials that are crucial for the clean transition is urgent. However, that's not the only problem. Environmental concerns, it's really one aspect of if we frame this question under just a transition, I think it goes way beyond the environmental standards. So back in China at that time, a lot of arguments were built by the Chinese government and the industry about how the Chinese communities they sacrificed their life, their health, their environment around them, risk to contaminated water, etc., to supply the rest of the world, but also, as well as China's domestic demand for rare earth and high-tech applications that that are sold at a much higher value and cost price in the global market. And however, that argument was not really taken in the dispute at the WTO when China cut its quota on rare earth export. And at the moment, since 2016, I think China has been really ramping up the enforcement, but also passing new industrial standards, environmental standards to regulate rare earth mining and other things. However, the question at the moment is that we simply don't have that amount of supply in the global market, not sufficient to meet, let alone China's own demand, but also the global demand that we are all the modelers are projecting for 2025, 2030, 2050, 2060, what are needed for the global transition. And it's very worrisome that Myanmar, for example, and other developing countries outside China are taking over some of the share in global supply from China in producing rare earths and other materials. Environmental standards, you can't really count on environmental standards in military-controlled Myanmar, where all the rare earth mining occur as illegal mining activities against its constitution and other local laws. So with that in mind, we really need to reconsider what rare earth and other critical raw materials crucial for the clean transition. What are the social costs? What are the real costs of that? And in terms of China-US cooperation on rare earths and securing other clean, this is very wordy, critical raw materials that are crucial for the clean transition, a lot of things can be done. Of course, raising the bar of environmental standards, seeking cooperation as well competition are crucial. But I also need to bring onto the table as well that China has been leading the technical revolutions on rare earth mining and also cobalt and lithium and a lot of other things, because China has been the hub for if not production, then also processing, refinery and manufacturing of these materials and turning them into components and key components for clean technologies. China owns the world's most patents on these technology innovations in this very niche field. If the US would like to catch up, which I would like to see that competition occur, because competition leads to, if that happens in a good way, in good competition brings down the cost, level up the standards, and that would benefit not just China and the US on rare earth supplies, but also the rest of the world. We simply can't allow Myanmar or Brazil or somewhere remote where governance is even less than laxed compared to China, to bear all that environmental and social cost for our global transition. Thank you.
I'm gonna evoke Rebecca's name again, Toby, because she just told me she's got a report coming out soon where they were looking, I believe, in the Andean countries, that over 15 years or so, like as different countries had like stricter regulations on social environmental issues and trying to see how that affected Chinese investment, and it evidently doesn't affect it. I was kind of surprised. we'll have to see when this report comes out. But remember, when China always says we will obey the rules in the host countries, and that it's and there's more and more anecdotes and reporting coming out that a lot of times the host countries, be it at the national or subnational level, are just like, come on in, China, giving them carte blanche. And I think that also points to an area where building the capacity and of the local governments or people to kind of push for stronger enforcement in their own countries. And there are should point out, and I didn't, I was figured it would come up in the Q&A, that there are quite a few kind of Chinese, I mean, there's NGOs and researchers and some with international involvement, these kind of greening BRI type partnerships that are happening, that are coming up with putting forward recommendations to the government on how to improve the green governance. Asia Society just issued a new tool to try to help to put out, lay out there to kind of help empower people in the host countries. Like, it's very boring kind of stuff, sorry, Asia Society, but important that, like, you know, not just saying about EIAs, but just different mechanisms along the entire path of a project, how to promote transparency. And it's vital. I had Kelly Chun, used to be from Hong Kong Science and Tech University, give a talk about the China-Laos Railroad, and that you hear these stories about labor abuses, and it's actually because part of it's because that you have these main Chinese state-owned enterprises that subcontract to a bazillion other subcontractors, and they hire locals, and then they're not getting the money on time, so they don't pay them, they quit. And she was telling stories about how basically Chinese laborers come in and the same thing happens to them, and when they get blamed, they get sent back. So it's just, it's very tough and complicated for, you know, for China to greening the BRI will be tough. And I mean, that was just like one little microcosm, but I'll stop there. But just like giving you some flavors of things. And I see some more questions are coming in. So Toby, I'll mute and back to you.
So let me go to this question from Stephen about greening the BRI. And let's see, I think there's a couple of, I'm not totally clear what the question is, a couple ways to interpret it. Stephen, feel free to clarify in the chat. So Stephen points to China hydro projects, which are a major issue in the Mekong River ecosystem. And there's a question here about greening the BRI. I think, let's see, I feel like the issue here is probably around, you know, on the one hand, hydropower is non-carbon, a non-carbon source of power. But on the other hand, like there's serious environmental, there are other environmental issues aside from the fact that it's a non-carbon source of energy. And I think, yeah, probably the question is like, how does this fit into the project of greening the BRI? Maybe there's a question here about how do we take the goal of greening the BRI seriously when there are projects like this that are a part of it. Yeah, one of those might be the questions, I'm not sure, but yeah.
Hongqiao, do you want to make a first crack?
Well, it's been a while that I haven't followed up on China's overseas hydropower projects, but just to give you some updates on the so-called Green BRI, or the greening of the Belt and Road Initiative. We've actually seen quite a lot of breakthrough very recently, in the past at least in the last year or two. To start with, on coal, China committed to not continue to finance overseas coal power projects, although that pledge is now challenged by some local projects very recently revealed. You know, coal projects being packed as clean energy projects that are still happening in some of the developing countries. But in addition to that, the state planner also issued actually the first high-level development opinion about greening BRI just in March. And in that particular policy, China outlined a dozen of fields of cooperation on green, areas of green cooperation, like in transportation, green industry, trade, finance, etc., but also, you know, infrastructure. And here, I believe hydropower is still considered as part of the green and the clean energy cooperation under the Green BRI framework. Although we can also see a very strong shift from the China side, shifting, you know, from wind and solar, from hydropower and coal projects, and or nuclear power projects to really the more cost-effective and cheaper wind and solar capacities. And that particular policy actually said to encourage companies to go out to build wind and solar projects, and to to develop a few best practice projects. But I guess what you're actually asking when you mentioned the Mekong River hydropower projects and the Green BRI, I assume, clarify me if I'm wrong in the chat, you want to argue, maybe you probably want to argue whether there is a conflict between the social impacts of migration or the challenges of transboundary water governance in projects like that, because some of the projects built within China, within the Chinese boundary and territory, are in the upper and the middle stream of these transboundary rivers, and they do have impact in the river basin. And whether that can be counted still as green projects, and also other projects built by Chinese companies or receiving finance from Chinese development banks in the region can still be counted as green project. I think still today, according to most of climate finance taxonomy in the EU or in China, these projects are still counted as green, still counted as climate friendly. Let's put it this way. But all the concerns on the social impacts should be fully addressed. And personally, I participated in one of the environmental and social impact assessment of one of Chinese hydropower companies' overseas project in Kashmir, in India, in the Pakistan-controlled Kashmir area. Companies do carry out environmental and social impact assessment, not just at the site, but also in the region, in the river basin. Whether that standard can be improved and that practice can be enhanced, that there is a question mark. But again, I think back to my initial point, the wind is changing. Having infrastructures like traditional fossil fuel energy projects like coal, gas power plants, oil pipelines are no longer the main focus. Clean energy projects like wind and solar, and potentially nuclear, but there's a big question mark and uncertainty on that. But wind and solar for sure are really becoming the next push of Green BRI projects. Back to you, Jennifer.
Yeah, I'll just point out that the Stimson Center, that they have a big initiative with using satellites and things to monitor the impact of how what's happening when China opens their dams, and so that they do have eye in the sky looking at what how China's managing the water in the upstream of the Mekong, how it's impacting the flow and the communities downstream. State Department has a big Mekong partnership project as well, so a little bit of that competition type thing to encourage stuff. Toby, I noticed that there was another question that how about how you're compared to the US, how are Europeans seen in China when it comes to climate and cooperation policy? And the Europeans have also been fairly active in that space as well, particularly, I mean, the Germans, the Norwegians, Italians, supporting a lot of, clean, the whole gamut, like similar to the US, but actually more, what's striking, probably helping to build, doing more projects within China, but there's still a lot of information sharing as well. But I think that over the past few years and, then Ukraine war and stuff, that the tensions have been, occurring between the US, Europe and China as well. I don't think it's shut the doors on the kinds of, I don't remember hearing of any formal door closure to the Europeans as we've just had right now. I'm hoping it's just temporary door closing, but yeah, there's Heinrich Böll Foundation supports has in the past supported grassroots organizations in China, etc. So I'll stop right there. Thanks, Toby.
Yeah, thank you. Let's see, Hongqiao, anything that you would add about how Europe is seen in China when it comes to climate cooperation?
But very quickly, I just want to make another point on relate to the last question. A lot of hydropower projects in the Mekong River and also in Africa and Latin America are actually, they were built or being built before BRI became a thing. BRI was first conceptualized in, I think, in early 2010 after Xi Jinping took his first presidency. So a lot of hydropower projects were already under development before BRI became a thing, and even before green BRI became a thing. So we need to distinguish and not to just to group everything with China's either overseas finance or project finance or subcontractors activities under the BRI framework. That's my kind of footnote to the last question. And Julia, thanks for your question. I'm looking forward to meeting you in Hamburg very soon. So basically, I think compared to the US, the Europe is relatively less hostile, if I can put it this way, on climate cooperation and the policy with China from the Chinese policymakers, but also civil society and the public in general. I think this is mainly due to the fact that most of the times Europe doesn't play a very strong, let's say, doesn't really have a strong position pushing China to do this and that, while we see a lot from the US, quote unquote, urging China to do this and that. But that's just one layer of my answer. The second layer would be, I think still, just like in China and the US, Europe is seen as a kind of a mediator between the bipolar, if that actually is a thing, is reality. Sorry, that's my cat. Two big power, two major power, China and the US, and Europe is really is mitigating the two powers and to pushing the climate agenda altogether forward, without creating a triangle position in climate diplomacy. And that's again my understanding. But also I think there's less competition if in clean technology and, let's say, chips and other we don't say that much trade wars or initiatives from the European Commission, the Parliament, compared to the United States. However, this is changing. The recent forced label ban that is in the discussion at the present to be discussed very soon, and I believe last year there was also sanctions from both China and Europe in relate to issues with Xinjiang. And all that has been changing and have an impact on our bilateral climate cooperation and the policies, of course. But again, I believe the conversation, climate dialogue between China and the EU has not been interrupted. They're still going forward. And even between the China and the US, or even though the official climate conversations are on pause, other channels, for example, the academic and the civil societies, they're still going on. The cooperation are still continuing to push agendas forward. But just to wrap up, I think we've heard a lot of discussions about climate cooperation and the competition with China cooperation versus cooperation. I don't think we are. We need to opt one or the other. We need both. We are really at the point of global transition that we need all solutions. We need both cooperation and competitions. Competitions are helpful. It's helpful to bring down the cost of technologies to enhance global supply chain, etc. And the cooperations on technology sharing and climate finance are also crucial to also to accelerate the transition. And yeah, I think I hope that answers your question.
I'm going to just make one little quick insert. When I remember I talked about the ag commodity issue, that the US and Europe are both looking at, developing legislation as a way to, to make sure that trees and beef and leather are not deforesting and causing problems. And even China, and when the Europeans and the US, if they come together, I mean, it was my very first webinar at the beginning of COVID. It was called Deforestation in the Time of COVID. Had some European and US folks talking about this. But even China, they just amended their forestry law, and they're starting to have some conversations there about, can we do this? How can we do this? So I think, but again, if the US and Europe come together on that kind of standard setting, it kind of helps. It's not, I don't know if you would necessarily not call that cooperation or competition, but just the raising the bar. And I think that's something too that I think is part of all these, Blue Dot Network and fast infra stuff coming from the West, the idea of setting higher standards. And, sometimes it's billed as like competition to BRI, which is like, well, but it's again, setting the standards and raising the bar, because that's going to be really vital as well.
Thanks to you both. Just one anecdote I'll add on China-Europe climate relationships. Earlier this year, China and France signed an agreement to cooperate on infrastructure, and particularly renewable energy projects mostly in Africa. And it was a deal worth $1.7 billion. They're agreeing to cooperate on $1.7 billion of these infrastructure projects with a special focus on renewable energy. Let's see. There is we have a question from our host John. Is interested in the impact of the war in Ukraine. Actually, before we go to that, maybe we have a new question from Nick. Let's see. So this is very good. So Nick writes, we're seeing more and more discourse in the US and in Europe and in the global South about China being a bad faith investor/creditor that doesn't care about environmental or social impact. It's being used increasingly to justify alternatives to Chinese financing and project development. And in some cases, these alternatives are also harmful to local ecosystems and narratives. And despite the prevalence of the debt trap narrative, for many African, Latin American, and Southeast Asian nations, there is far more debt owed to commercial Western multinational banks and other private sector creditors like BlackRock than there is to Chinese public finance institutions. I think maybe an example we can look to there is Sri Lanka, which is undergoing a severe crisis related also to its debt burdens. And there's that's one of the big narratives around the so-called Chinese debt trap has focused on the debt owed by Sri Lanka to China. But that is a case also where there's more debt owed to commercial Western creditors than to China. So that would be one example and a very urgent one. Does this overemphasis on China's role in financing development detract from efforts to raise standards for multinational corporations and financial institutions regarding climate and justice? I guess, I think it's an important question. One way I think about this question is basically about how China gets scapegoated on problems that are sort of more systemic and apply to China, but also apply to Western countries and often companies in the West. So yeah, Jennifer Hongqiao, any thoughts on this?
No, I mean, I think you're probably the best one to answer this, but just made me think too, back to, going back to the dam question, is like, we used to build dams, World Bank used to build dams, we don't anymore. In fact, China's hydropower construction was modeled on the US model. US, our government experts helped cite the Three Gorges Dam back in the day until we decided not to get involved with it. But so, yeah, no, I think Nick, I think that's a great question, and it makes you. That's why I'm actually going to start having some meetings on this topic, bringing some of the Blue Dot and the fast infra folks in to try to really understand that, yes, they want to get greener projects out there, but just wondering, well, what about, I'm also concerned about the social justice angle to it. And a lot of that means that, and it's trying to attract more private investment as well. So just, I think it's still, not going to be that easy. But no, I think I don't know if Hongqiao had any final comment or on that, but no, excellent question.
I'm not an overseas finance expert, but myself in my work, I struggle a lot with certain frames on China's activities on climate change here and there, certain narratives widely cited and used, applied on China's climate actions here and there. And a lot of them are more, let's say, politicized than factual. And in the case you cited about Tobita Chow, I believe a lot of scientific studies have, peer-reviewed papers have confirmed that Tobita Chow doesn't exist. And to my understanding, based on all the great research and podcasts that I've heard from the China-Africa project, which is now called the Chinese in the South project, I think a lot of the so-called Chinese overseas finance are demand-driven. If not China, if not Chinese development banks, there will be other banks. There will be other financial institutions. However, the difference is that the China's development banks offer relatively lower interest loans compared to the commercial banks, of course, but they also World Bank sometimes. And again, they also operate in very dangerous zones with very high risks, where all the other banks would not dare or afford to operate, and that creates a vacuum of space for Chinese activities. And I also think, since you come from the donor community, I also think donors have a crucial role to play in shaping or reshaping the narratives and how we see China, the emergence of China in not just the development world, but also climate actions. With so much funding flowing into coal, which is a crucial issue, important, significant issue in China, but not much emphasis, not much supports, financial supports, institutional supports, infrastructure supports have been given to, for example, issues about how do we understand China's wind and solar expansion at such an astonishing speed? How can we learn and, how can we, what had happened, what has created that miracle? And is that sustainable? Or issues like just a transition within China. We talk about coal transition, just a transition in the coal sector elsewhere, but not much in China. What had happened there? What about the unemployment and the structural unemployment resulted from the decarbonization within China? Not much discussion there. And outside China, same question. We have heard so much about, for example, China controlling, China dominating, China weaponizing its influence, its control on, or its dominance in the rare earth supply chain or critical raw material supply chain within China and elsewhere. But we don't hear much about how, how can we improve and elevate the entire value chain of rare earth or other materials so that resource abundant countries like China in the case of rare earths, or like lithium or cobalt in the case of in the case of cobalt in Congo DRC, being benefited and taking a fair share from the booming clean tech industry. I think all that should be addressed if we really want to have a fair conversation about what is actually happening with China's emergence in China and the world. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thanks to you both for your comments. Just one more thing I will add to this question is around, as Nick points out in the question, in many cases, there's far more debt owed to Western banks and other private creditors than to China. There's a very good report on this that came out recently from some friends in the UK, a group called Debt Justice, that breaks this down very clearly. I believe part of the reason that they released that report is that they're campaigning to address these emerging debt crises across a number of global South countries, and looking for and demanding negotiations that will bring debt relief to these countries. And in that campaign work for debt relief in the global south, they repeatedly run into this narrative that the problem is China, and that has become an excuse that Western actors will use to block progress on debt relief for these global south countries. So that's something that they've encountered in their work as an obstacle and a problem. And I believe that's a big part of the reason why they released this report that lays out what Nick mentions in that question. So I think like this dynamics of turning China into a scapegoat in order to avoid dealing with more systemic problems is a problem on the debt issue, and I think others as well. Let's see. Okay, so then I want to turn back to the question from John about the impact of the war in Ukraine. I think there's a couple of aspects to this question. One would be impacts on climate policy and energy use domestically within China. Another part of the question, though, I think is also sort of the geopolitical impacts and how it affects China's climate relationships with other countries. So yeah, Jennifer Hongqiao, any thoughts on the impact, if any, of the war in Ukraine?
I think this is more of a Hongqiao one.
Yeah. Okay. So again, I'm a journalist and analyst. I'm a consultant. I don't cover every single issue. So I will share with you what I have observed in recent policy change in relate to the Ukraine war in China. I think the overall trend since at least 2020, not even 2020. I think in the past few years, China is really pushing energy security to the top of its agenda, even before for example, the power shortage in last summer, and again recently in Sichuan, the Yunnan, and other provinces across China in light of the heat wave. So with energy security becoming a top priority, China also wants, naturally, to gain full independence, if possible, on energy supplies. And in that case, the war in Ukraine, in Europe, I'm based in Europe, we've heard so much discussion about gas supply from Russia. But why at that time, when the war first happened in I think in February, I look into the dependency of China on fossil fuel supplies from Russia. Compared to Europe, is very small. So Russia has some impact. The imports from Russia has some impact to China, but not as significant, at least compared to, for example, Germany. 70% of gas. I'm not sure that the number is correct, but a huge amount of gas come from Russia. That's not the case in China. China doesn't rely on any single country for gas supply. On pipeline, yes, from 5 countries, 3 from Central Asia, then Russia. But with LNG imports, it has a dozen of suppliers. So has that actually changed China's policies on energy supplies, on energy imports? A few points to make. To start with, if we look at China's actual energy fossil fuel imports in the past few months, between January 2022 to August 2022, coal imports has dropped significantly, oil and gas as well. And this is a result of a series of events. For example, economic downturn in China, the demand for fuel has decreased, and China is also ramping up domestic production on coal and oil and gas, and that substitute some of the imports from overseas. But again, and that's only one aspect. But again, back to what I said in the first place, energy security in China means gaining independency as much as possible to the maximum. So if anything that China has learned from the outbreak of the war is that ensuring energy supply, what she said last year was, holding the rice bowl of energy supply at our own hands. And that would really become, it has already become the trend, and it will be enhanced. That trend will be further enhanced in the years to come as China transition to a power energy mix and a power mix with higher percentage of renewable energy produced domestically. And that would be a change maker, because the dependency on fossil fuel imports would be gone, would be, to start with, decreased, and then with, as I shared earlier, 80%, above 80% of non-fossil energy produced domestically, the dependency on any single country or any or the dozen of LNG importers would be decreased. So I think we need to understand China's climate transition in different aspects, and energy security is one way to look at it. Because if in a world, in a scenario that China can produce all this energy that it needs domestically from wind, solar, hydro, nuclear, with some coal to regulate the flexibility and stability of the grid, then energy security would be enhanced. I'm not sure that answered your question, but I have to discuss further.
I think that's very helpful. Thank you, Hongqiao. Let's see, if I can insert a question of my own. Something that is often on my mind is some of the dominant narratives that are out there around China and climate, and like, how do we respond to them? So one very common, something that seems like, if it's not a dominant narrative, it's a pretty common one, is that China is not a reliable partner on climate. So even if we talk about the importance of climate talks with China and cooperation on climate with China, a common response that I get when I talk about this is that it doesn't matter, China can't be relied on in climate negotiations and talks and so on. I think this was also maybe mentioned, this also, I think maybe it came up in that Wall Street Journal editorial that Hongqiao mentioned. Yeah, based on your research and also experience, what do you make of this notion?
It's kind of an old, it seems to be a little bit dated kind of argument. I mean, because China did see when they spoiled the Copenhagen discussions on climate discussions, they kind of realized they were shooting themselves in the foot. But also point out to, I gave you that quick story about how, the U.S. China climate agreement in 2014, and that actually, that had that little bit of that cooperative competitors element that Hongqiao was talking about, but it motivated both countries to act. I mean, during Obama administration, we really ramped up our solar power installations. China did twice as much, just because, there. So there was a little bit of that kind of competition. And I think that, if you talk to John Kerry and Xie Zhenhua, that they both see that, we are the carbon superpowers of the world, and not talking doesn't help the situation at all. But again, because of the sensitivities, I think that there are going to be, ways where maybe more in the multilateral fora that, the two countries coming together. But Xi Jinping, what did, when Hongqiao started, she laid out all of these are the carbon neutrality goals. This is, he's put a lot of political stake in reaching these goals. To be honest, where there could be criticism is that China could actually probably move even faster in some ways. But it's true that there's been some slippage, because with the power outages that happened again, that China starting to build more coal-fired power plants. And I'm sure this little red mark on Hongqiao's head is her smacking it, because she and a lot of us know that at least half of China's existing coal-fired power plants or whatnot, are they're not being utilized or hardly being utilized. So it was very much a political move. And sometimes, I don't know, Hongqiao, do we still have cases where provinces are sometimes a little bit naughty? I mean, but then Hongqiao, you laid out that cool chart, that the report from Greenpeace, how a lot of cities and provinces really are ramping up their decarbonization, because that really is, that's the core policy that everyone has to comply to.
Well, a few very quick comments on the impacts of the short-term events like the heat wave and the drought in Sichuan. Has that accelerated China's clean transition, or has it delayed the transition? For example, as Jennifer indicated, does that provide a reason, a justification for local provinces to get ahead with coal power plants? To some degree, yes, some coal power plants that are already in the pipeline, that have already completed preliminary studies, for example, are recently approved. But compared to a few things, to start with, compare on to year-on-year increase, newly added coal capacity is smaller over the years, and the growth had slowed down if we compare on year-on-year basis. And if we compare that with China's actual build out of wind and solar capacity, that is really like a small peanut. Can China further accelerate its current climate actions? Sure, but how much more? It's already very difficult for us to even imagine a year earlier that China is adding 157 gigawatts of wind and solar this year, and actually added 114 gigawatts of wind and solar last year. And to put that into context, I believe Germany, the third largest country of installed capacity of wind and solar, only have about 124 gigawatts of wind and solar in 2021. So with that in mind, China is adding the size of Germany, a size of wind and solar, wind and solar capacity with the size of Germany's total installed capacity every single year. And can that be further accelerated? Sure, but that would require a lot of more conditions. But at the same time, I need to emphasize coal. China is still building coal power plants, and also, as Jennifer indicated, across China, the current coal fleet only operates below 50% of its designed utilization capacity, which means 50% of the time they're not operating. And the idea, from top designers and advisors of China's energy transition, actually believe these coal power plants should stay for a really long time in the next few decades. However, the operational hours will further decline, not just maintain at 50% with big loss in basically they don't earn money, but still they need to further decrease their operational hours to about a quarter of today's level in the next few decades. So sure, you can argue that is a huge sunk cost if China still want to build more coal power plants, but at the same time, to the planners who have actually made the plans of China's decarbonization, they believe coal power plants need to stay because they are already built. Why not use them to accommodating more wind and solar to provide the flexibility to the grid that are needed for the transition? So there are different approaches to understand. I'm not arguing, I'm not endorsing whether this approach is great or not. This is simply the strategy that the Chinese government, the Chinese policymakers have taken. Clean coal is controversial. We have to admit that. But in the particular context in China, this is still a very logical. If you follow their logic, this is a logical move to keep the coal power plants alive, but reducing operational hours so that coal use will decline over the years. Coal use will start to peak very soon, actually, if not already peaked, in the next 2-3 years, and then continue to decrease. So to wrap up, I see some small, let's say at the local levels, as Jennifer characterized it, some naughty provinces, and might have go ahead with coal power projects or even high emitting projects. But at the central level, they are really controlling with strong policies, strong toolkits to make sure that the transition is happening in the longer term, that we're marching towards this end goal of net zero, but also the near-term goal to peak emissions as soon, not as soon as possible, but really ahead of the deadline of the pledged 2030. Yeah, and I personally, I do have doubt. I don't think personally that China will opt for the business as usual approach, like what we witnessed I think 14 years ago after 2008 financial crisis, with this 4 trillion investment plan, stimulus plan to boost the economy. I don't think that's happening. I don't think that will happen. Even China will boost investment, will boost infrastructure to save the economy, to boost the economy. Clean energy and the infrastructure like energy storage, like grids, interconnection will be really the new goal for China to go ahead with. Thank you.
Thank you. I think so. Seeing not any questions left in the Q&A, I think we can close on one follow-up to this question of like how to understand the seriousness of Chinese leaders on in their commitments, their climate commitments. I think one useful way to think about this question is like what are the motivations, like what motivates China's leaders to take their commitments seriously? Like what interests does it serve to make ambitious commitments and follow through on them? And some that I can recall both of you mentioning are, so Jennifer, you mentioned one instigator for this push was the rise of pollution protests within China. And one of the very top priorities for Chinese leaders is to maintain social stability. So shifting away from highly polluting industries is can be understood as addressing that goal of social stability. Hongqiao, you also mentioned that shifting to renewable energies is a strategy for increasing China's energy security. That can be another, we can understand it as another way that China's leaders can see this as in their interests. Another that comes to my mind is that I think that China sees an opportunity to build soft power by positioning itself as a global climate leader. It made a particularly strong move towards that under the Trump administration, when it became clear to many around the world that given that we can sometimes elect presidents like Trump, the US is not necessarily the most reliable leader on climate, and China saw this as an opportunity, particularly in a number of global South countries where leaders care a lot about climate issues and want to see leadership on climate. Are there any other considerations that make climate commitments and this energy transition really in their interests? Like what are some of the other interests that motivate them?
Economic. I mean, the solar panel example. I mean, they flooded, if China, China flooded the world with all these cheaper solar PV panels, and that enabled part of our global transition. And there's a lot of complaints about that because they were cheap, but I mean, many studies have cited that where clean energy is installed, that's where 75% of the jobs happen. So people say, like, doesn't matter whoever makes them, it's great, but where they're installed is where the actual money making happens. And I mean, but that was a template. And so now but it was also done, keep in mind in China that the solar PV stuff, this was not free market. This is like, I call it solar power Darwinism. Like they gave a lot of feed-in tariffs. And then in 2018, in May, there was this day, it was called Freezing Day, where the government said, we're pulling all of your subsidies today. And then 2 years later, half of the solar power private companies had disappeared. Same thing with electric vehicles. I mean, not only was, were they given incentives, they even helped create the market. If you wanted to get a license in Shanghai and Beijing, you wait forever. There's lotteries, a long time. But if you get an electric vehicle, you're to the front of the queue. So you have all these Chinese folks that were buying electric vehicles early on. And not all the electric vehicles were that great, but they had a car. So you had this, they build this market with, government pushing. And then, I mean, just this year, I think they started cutting the subsidies by 30%. Same kind of thing, they're picking their winners and no shame in it. Right? They just do it. But then you also have innovators like BYD in Guangdong with the battery technologies. I mean, Shenzhen flipped almost overnight to electric vehicles for their buses because the mayor said, we're going to do this. BYD's there. They did it. And BYD is going overseas. And, and it's one of the rarer examples of a Chinese clean energy company, making big, going overseas, because it still is difficult, kind of link our two topics today about clean energy and BRI. It is more difficult for some of these private companies to get overseas onto whatever, and just what is the BRI anyway, right? It's a name, but it can be more difficult. And then even if with like even the solar and the wind, great, they want to build these things overseas, but you need a grid. And remember when China back in like 2016, when they put all the solar panel and wind farms up, and 30% of it was like garbage wind or garbage solar because there wasn't a grid to move it through. But that's just how China works, right? They do it fast and then kind of make it up later. They finally getting their bigger grid systems built, the fastest and, high transmission lines in the world. So, that's the challenge of renewables. But what I'd like to see more of, and maybe we will now, since they're not going to build coal overseas, is that China's distributed renewable energy, the rooftop, and some of these kind of innovations. I'd like to see, China made lots of efforts, oftentimes in partnership with the US, on energy efficiency buildings, right? The standards, the monitoring, take those kind of things on the road too. So, all right, I'll stop there. I think we're hitting up to the deadline, so maybe take over, Toby.
Yeah. We're about at time. Hongqiao, good to see you again. Jennifer, great pleasure to meet you. And thanks to John for bringing us together. John, do you have final comments?
Oh, just to say thank you to all the presenters. And thank you to you, Toby, for expert moderating. We will have this available on YouTube eventually if you need to see some of those slides again, which were very helpful. And would welcome you to our other IPS events, including one on climate debt, which we'll be holding next week that you can see at our Global Just Transition website for more details. So thank you again for everyone. And I'd like to see you all again at our next events.
Thanks so much.